Being in a dark place is a tough place to be. And if you can talk to your physician about that dark place, he or she may be able to help you in ways you wouldn't have anticipated because they may have been in that same dark place. Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here with the Dr. Scott Jensen podcast. Thanks for joining us. Once again, I want to highlight the fact that I wrote a book called We've Been Played. And if you'd like to get a copy of it, you can go to drscottjensenbook.com. One of the motivating forces for doing this podcast are the words of George Orwell. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. Never in my life did I think that I would be living this out, but I certainly am. Today I want to talk about this. When physicians speak of dark places, it may be because physicians have been in dark places. I read recently numerous articles about physician suicide. I've read articles about suicide from 0 to 20 years of age and 20 to 40 and 40 to 60 and above 60. One physician said these words. Dr. Deborah Williams said, "For physicians, there is an incredible stigma associated with seeking help for mental health and saying you're not okay. We are trained to be tough, resilient, superhuman, make no mistakes. So you don't show emotion, you don't cry, you don't ask for help. We've all fallen into that trap." I've had patients ask me, come on, doc, you got a good life. You got a good income, you can pay the bills, take your vacations, whatever. You really have a good life. And I do. But unfortunately, there are many of my colleagues that don't. Do you want to take a guess at how many physicians commit suicide in the United States annually? Every year? Nearly 400. 400 doctors every year commit suicide. My medical school class, many years ago, was a little more than 200. 400 physicians would literally be taking 2 graduating medical school classes from around the country, and they're dead. The hospital I work with the most has recently put out a statistic saying 25% of Minnesotans live with mental illness. I think that's right. I recently read an article about a young lady who's one heck of a basketball player. She's a teenager, and she talked about how walking onto the basketball court is her safe space. She suffers from obsessive-compulsive disease. In the article that I read, it commented that this is a rare disorder. Wrong. Obsessive-compulsive disorders are not rare. They can be overwhelming. They can take over our lives. I am absolutely convinced that frequently the obsessive-compulsive tendencies we have, where we think about things that don't make sense, don't represent real thoughtful considerations that we would entertain, but they're there, that by obsessing these thoughts, letting them spiral out of control, we feel like we're moving into a dark place. Oftentimes there will be an associated physical action to try to, if you will, diminish or ameliorate the impact of that obsessive thought. And so that compulsion might be to say things 2 times or 4 times, to brush your teeth, so many strokes of the brush against your teeth, checking locked doors, reading a sentence over and over. There's all kinds of manifestations, but I'm convinced that obsessive-compulsive tendencies can oftentimes evolve into disorders, which can oftentimes evolve into frank depression, which can absolutely invite suicide. We have people talking more and more about mental health, but I do not think that we're really getting to the problem. As a healthcare provider, it's my job to try to make certain that we have a community of support surrounding you so that your needs will be met. And I want to comment on 3 specific problems we have in our mental health system today. Number 1, we've got to open the door so that people who have dark thoughts, dark spaces, dark places, they have a place to initiate a relationship so they can talk about it. We have not adequately provided for opening the door. And if you can't open the door, that means you stuff it, and you have a much greater chance of becoming suicidal. Second problem we have in our mental health system today is we haven't bridged the gap. So you might have someone that you can talk about. You may have a relationship with a counselor or a therapist or whoever. But in those moments where you're facing a crisis, where it's not between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday through Friday, that you need someone, what happens then? I'll tell you very candidly. As a family practice doctor in a clinic, one of the hardest phone calls that we get is the 4 o'clock phone call where someone's suicidal. What do we do as a clinic at 4 o'clock in the afternoon other than to say call 911? No one wants to be the last contact for someone who commits suicide. Somehow, our system has absolutely been unable to bridge the gap so that when you're not in a stable therapeutic relationship and in a good space or place, but instead your world is reeling, we have got to make sure that the gap has been bridged so that you can get help, so that that momentary intensity of anxiety leading to potential suicide ideation, suicidal planning, and ultimately suicide gets to dissipate. And we have to stop the stereotyping. And that's why I share with you what's happening with physicians regarding suicide. If people realize that 400 physicians a year commit suicide, maybe we can stop the stereotyping. Physicians are arguably intelligent, competitive students, did well in academics, trained to be strong, 10, 15 years of education, and yet 400 physicians commit suicide every year. More than 10% of physicians think about suicide every year. In this country, we have something like 1 million physicians. Can you imagine? If more than 10% of those, that means 100,000 physicians a year think about suicide. And female physicians have a much higher rate. But male physicians also have a very high rate of suicidal ideation or thinking. So friends, being in a dark place is a tough place to be. And if you can talk to your physician about that dark place, he or she may be able to help you in ways you wouldn't have anticipated because they may have been in that same dark place. You might wonder, why am I harping on this? I've talked about it before. Why am I saying that we haven't opened the door, we haven't bridged the gap, we haven't stopped the stereotyping? Let me close with a story. It was a beautiful spring day. I had meetings until 11:30 at night. And when I got home, my wife said, "Are you on call tonight?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Well, I'm not sure what's going on, but the emergency room has called you 2 or 3 times in the last 20 minutes, and I've only been home a half an hour. You better give them a call." So I called the emergency room at the local hospital. They said, "Doc, Jensen, everything okay?" I said, "Well, yeah, thanks for asking. I just got home." "Why are you calling me?" They said, "Well, we got a call from another big hospital, metropolitan hospital, and they've got a problem and they think you could help." I said, "What's up?" They said, "Well, it's something about a suicide." And I thought, well, what's that about? And I thought maybe a patient of mine had committed suicide and they wanted some backstory, some history. So I got off the phone with the local hospital ER and I called the Metropolitan Hospital. And I said, Dr. Scott Jensen here. And the person I spoke with was clearly surprised. You're Dr. Scott Jensen? Yeah, yes, I am. What can I do for you? Well, we've got a body here, and we can't identify it, and we thought you could help. And I said, why did you think I could help? I'm still thinking it's a patient. And they said, well, there's no identification with this person other than the fact that there's a piece of paper in his pocket, and it says Scott Jensen, and it has your home phone number. My heart sank. My mind flooded with the recollection that I hadn't seen my brother Bruce in at least a month. Now, my brother Bruce, he was a nice young man, but he had mental illness, and he struggled. To make a long story a little shorter, the Metropolitan Hospital asked if I could please come down and see if I could identify the body. Was it a patient of mine? Was it a friend of mine? Was it a family member? So in the wee hours of the morning, I drove down to this Metropolitan Hospital. And when I got there, they wanted to sort of play a little bit of a cat and mouse question and answer game whereby I could tell them something that would confirm the identity of this cadaver. And I put a kibosh on that and said, just take me to where you need to take me and let me take a look, and I can tell you in a moment if I know. I thought we'd go down to the morgue, but for whatever reason, that hospital's morgue was a very busy place that night, that wee morning. And so they said, okay, well, we'll get a room. And basically they had me sit there. And while I was sitting there, I heard the elevator next to me ding. The elevator door opened, and there was an orderly, or some type, a person like that, with a gurney, with a body and a sheet over it. And he invited me to come in the elevator and take a look at the body. And it was Bruce, my brother. He had jumped out of a building from 18 stories up. So that's usually a pretty predictable outcome. I was flooded from then even to this day, and it's been over 30 years, with questions about, could I have done more? Was I really there when he needed me? And when I get more clinical, I think, did we open the door for Bruce? Did we bridge the gap to make sure his needs in times of crisis were met? Was he a victim of some of the stereotyping that goes on when someone suffers from a mental health diagnosis? That's why I harp on it. 400 doctors every year commit suicide. 10% of physicians around the country think about suicide. Young people commit suicide at an astonishing rate. 25% of high school students think about suicide sometime during their high school years. I think we can work harder to open the door, close the gap, and stop the stereotyping.